Be'ezrat Hashem, with God's help, today we begin the second set of laws in this third book of the Rambam, which he titles Hilchos Eiruvin, the laws of the Eiruv. Eiruv literally means mixing, and as we're going to see over the next 8 days, there are 8 chapters in this set of laws. This is a reference to 2 rabbinic mechanisms that are directly related and follow up to the laws of Shabbos, which we just concluded. The Rambam himself is going to be quite elaborate in describing the purpose of these Eiruvs and how they work. But just briefly, we're going to be discussing what's called Eiruv Chatzerot and Eiruv Tchumin, the mixing of the courtyards and the mixing of the borders. We learned for a considerable amount of time in the laws of Shabbos about the melacha of carrying. We cannot transfer from a private domain to a public domain and vice versa. There were certain areas, as we saw, that open to the public domain and therefore were considered by the rabbis as more severe, treated as a public domain, until it was demarcated clearly that it's a private domain. The classic example was the mavoi, the alleyway. Since it opens right to the public domain, the rabbi said you have to put up a lechi or a korah, a vertical beam or a cross beam, to show the public domain ends here, from here on in begins the private domain. The thing is, though, there's one more piece to the puzzle. Once you have a shared space, where many people have access to, the rabbis were worried that if we just let you treat it like a private domain, you're going to start thinking that you can carry out also into actual public domains. Because you go, hey, we all share the courtyard, we all share the alleyway, and we're all allowed to carry there. Maybe we can carry into the street. So the rabbis, beginning with actually King Solomon, as the Rambam will tell us, said that in order to carry in a shared space, all the residents of that shared space have to make a legal declaration that says that they are one single unit. They're converting themselves from private residence to a joint association, if you will. The way it was done was through food. Everybody would chip in to buy some food, and then over that food they would say, we're all becoming one entity. And hence the shared space is no longer a space that's shared by 5 or 6 private residents. Now it's just considered to be one joint space. It's an actual private domain, and not everybody was allowed to carry in that space. And the first 5 chapters of these halachot are dedicated to the technicalities of how this Eiruv Chatzerot worked. The second Eiruv, discussed in chapters 6 to 8, is called the Eiruv Tchumin, the mixing of the borders. And this is related to a topic which we had at the very end of the laws of Shabbos, the idea that on Shabbos one cannot walk past a certain limit outside of the city's borders. It's called the Tchum Shabbos, the border of the Shabbos. It's about 2,000 amot, 2,000 cubits, 3,000 feet outside of a city's limits. However, if a person desires to walk past that, there's a mechanism, there's a way that you can allow yourself to travel even further than the city's limits. And that's also through food. You take some food, you put it at the very end of the typical Tchum Shabbat, let's say 2,000 amot outside of the city, you put your food down there, and thereby you declare that you're taking in Shabbos in that place, and now you can walk an additional 2,000 amot from where you put your Eiruv down. And that also has a bunch of complexities and legalities, which the Rambam discusses in those 3 chapters, the last 3 chapters of this set of laws. So that's where we're going. We're going to learn about essentially 2 addendums to the laws of Shabbos. How to make a shared area converted into one unit so we can carry there, and how to allow ourselves to walk even past the limitation which we cannot walk on Shabbos. As the Rambam always does, he begins a set of laws by telling us which mitzvahs we're going to be discussing in this set of laws. And here we have something fascinating. It's our first time coming across this in the Rambam, although it's not going to be the last. The Rambam says, mitzvahs asay achas. We're going to be discussing one commandment, one positive commandment, v'himi divrei soifrim ve'ena min haminyan. But it's rabbinic in nature, and therefore it's not part of the count of the 613. These halachot only discuss the rabbinic mechanisms related to the laws of Shabbos. So there isn't any biblical mitzvah being discussed in these laws. Just the mitzvah of the rabbinic Eiruv. There's some discussion in the commentaries why it's called only one mitzvah if we're dealing with two different mechanisms. Some say it's because it all falls under the same umbrella. It's trying to fix things that are related to Shabbos, so it becomes one single unit. Be that as it may, the Rambam says, "Ubir mitzvah zu biprakim elu." The explanation of this mitzvah and how exactly the Eiruv works follows in the coming chapters. And we begin with Hashem's help, Perek Rishon in chapter 1, halacha aleph, halacha number 1. Chatzer sheyesh ba shchenim harbe. A courtyard which has many residents dwelling in it. You You can see it in the picture here, although it's not many. Each courtyard has just 2 homes, but the idea is there's more than one person per courtyard. Kol echad mehan bebayis la'atzma. Each one lives in his own house. Din Torah, biblical law would dictate, sheyiyu kulan mutarin letaltel b'chol hachatzer, that everybody in that courtyard should be allowed to carry in the entire courtyard, umibatim lechatzer, umeachatzer labatim, from the houses to the courtyard, from the courtyard to the houses. Since the entire courtyard is enclosed by 4 walls, it has all the biblical criteria of a private domain, and just like in a private domain, you can carry completely in every single part of it. Here too, even if there's more than one person living in the private domain, they should all be allowed to carry in the shared space. As the Rambam says immediately, the entire courtyard should be treated as one private domain, and it should be allowed to carry in the entirety of the domain. Let's take it a little further. The same biblical law should apply in an alleyway which has been marked, as the rabbis commanded, which has been marked with a vertical beam or a cross beam. Once you've made that demarcation and shown that the alleyway becomes a private domain, the law should be that all the people who have properties opening to the alleyway should be able to carry in the alleyway freely, and from the courtyards to the alleyway, and from the alleyway to the courtyards. Because the entire alleyway should convert to becoming one big private domain. Let's go even further, says the Rambam. The same law should apply to an entire city, assuming it's surrounded by a wall, 10 tfachim high, which is the criteria to convert everything inside it to a private domain. And it has doors that are locked at night as well. That the entire city, in other words, the entire combination of homes and courtyards and alleyways, which turns into a little city surrounded by the wall, should all be considered one private domain, and everybody should be allowed to carry in the entirety of the city. Zehu din Torah, this is biblical law. Halacha beis, aval medivrei seifrim, but rabbinically the rabbi said, Asur l'shcheinim l'taltel b'reshus hayachid, it is forbidden for neighbors to carry in a private domain, sheyesh ba chaluka b'diyorin, which has divided areas for residents. In other words, if the homes belong to different people, the courtyard, which is shared by all of them, is treated like a public domain relative to their home. And the same way you wouldn't carry from your house onto the street, you cannot carry from your house into the courtyard. Unless she'ya'arvu kol hashchenim kulan me'erev Shabbos, that all the neighbors living in the courtyard make an Eiruv, declare themselves a mixture. They make themselves into one unit before Shabbos. And this law applies in all the scenarios we mentioned above. Echad chatzer, ve'echad mavoi, ve'echad amedina. Whether we're talking about a courtyard, and the individual homes want to be able to carry in the courtyard, or we're talking about an alleyway, so the multitude of courtyards can carry into the alleyway, or we're talking about a city where all the alleyways want to carry into the streets of the city. In all these cases, whoever wants to be able to carry in the joint area must first make the Eiruv. This matter has been enacted by King Solomon and his high court. The Rambam says, Halacha Gimel, the same applies to any set of permanent structures that share a space. So if people are choosing to dwell in tents, you have a whole tent city, and not because they're traveling. This is where they live. Oy sukkos, or a bunch of huts, oy machane, or an army camp, sheikifu mechitza, that people are dwelling there permanently, and they've established a wall. They made a partition around it. So now everything within the partition is the joint space accessible to all the people who are living in the different tents or the different huts. Nobody can carry from one tent to another until they all make an Eiruv, till they all mix themselves together. Avol, but shayara shehikifan mechitza, if it's a caravan surrounded by a wall, the caravan is temporary. So then, ein tzrichin la'arev. They don't have to make an Eiruv. They're allowed to carry from one tent to another with no mixing, no Eiruv, because by default, by the very nature of what they're doing, they're already mixed. They've already declared themselves one unit. We're traveling together. And the tents are not temporary, are not permanent, they're temporary. So therefore, there's no reason to require the Eiruv. In the case of the tent city, everybody lives in tents, that's where they live. They've made it established, they made it permanent, so they must have an Eiruv to allow carrying from one to the other. But in the case of the caravan, they're already considered to be one entity because their tents are not permanent and they're traveling together. But be that as it may, it applies to all shared spaces the obligation to make an Eruv. Halacha daled umipnei ma tiken shleimei davar zeh. Why indeed did King Solomon make this enactment? What was wrong? You have a shared space, it's closed by four walls, it's a private domain. Why make problems? Says the Rambam, there was a very valid concern. They didn't want the people to make a mistake and to say, and the Rambam first uses the case of the city, the city-wide, the entire city which is enclosed by walls. People might make a mistake and say the following. The same way we're allowed to carry from our courtyards to the streets of the city and its markets, and the same way we're permitted to bring stuff in from the city's markets and streets to our courtyards. In the same way, we can also go past the city's borders. We can carry things out from the streets of the city to the fields outside the city, or to bring stuff in from the fields into the city. The Yachshav, people will think that markets and streets of cities, since they are accessible by all, they are to be treated like fields and like deserts. And they'll say that it is only courtyards that are considered to be a private domain. This is kind of already a different part of the concern. First is a concern that people are going to take license to carry things outside the city's borders. Then there's going to become a concern. People are going to say, hey, everybody's carrying in the public areas of the streets and the markets. That's considered public domain. Only courtyards where people live privately are called private domains. You can't make a big private domain in the city, even though that's untrue. The Adamu, and then they'll ultimately think that there is no work of carrying. And it's just permitted to carry and to bring in from private domains to public domains. This could lead to a disaster. Because people won't realize the nuances. Oh yeah, the door's closed. Oh yeah, it's surrounded by a wall. They're not going to realize. They're going to say, you know what, this is how we do it. We grew up, we carried from our houses to the courtyards, to the backyards, to the streets. No issues. It's going to cause a problem. Halacha Hey says the Rambam lefichach tikein, therefore King Solomon made an enactment. That any time there's a private domain which is divided by residents, and now there's room to examine and to look at it more like a public domain than a private one, whereby each resident takes a place that's specified for him in those courtyards that we saw before. Everybody has a home, a private home where they live, and is left over a place that's joint, accessible to everybody, and everybody owns it equally, like a courtyard serves for homes, that we should consider the place where everybody has equal access to, as though it's a domain for the public. And we will consider every individual area where every individual resident took as his home, that it should be a private domain unto itself. And therefore it will be forbidden to carry from the possession which you've taken for yourself, your private home, to the possession where everybody's hands are equal. In the very same way that it's forbidden to carry from a private domain to a public domain. Everybody on Shabbos should be able to use only the space which has been divided for themselves, until or unless they all make the Eiruv, declaring themselves mixed together, even though technically, biblically, it's all considered to be a private domain. But the rabbis were worried, so they said, you know what? Only your home is the private domain. Every shared area is a public domain unless you make an Eiruv. And you show yourselves actively that we're all making ourselves into one big unit, then your courtyard or your alleyway or the entire city becomes one big private domain. Says the Rambam, you've told me a lot about making the Eiruv. What is the actual Eiruv? How do you go about it? Halacha vavu mahu ha'eruv hazeh. What is this Eiruv to which we refer? Who it is, sheyis'arvu b'machal echad. Everybody should unite over one food. The whole city. Everybody grabs onto one piece of food, shemanichin oisem erev Shabbos, which we put aside before Shabbos, kloimar, as though to say, shekulanu me'oiravin ve'oichel echad lekulanu. We're all mixed up, you see? We all eat the same food. Ve'ein kol echad mimenu chelik reshus michaveri, and nobody among us separates himself on his own from anybody else. Ela kashem sheyad kulanu shava b'makim zeh, shenishar lekulanu. The same way All of our hands are equal. In the place where we have equal access to, so too do we declare that our hands are all equal in sharing in every individual resident's home as well. And thereby we are all becoming one domain. And by forcing them to do this action, once you got to take this action, nobody will come to make a mistake. Nobody will come to wrongly think that it is permitted to carry and take in from a private domain to a public domain. Everybody will understand. A real private domain and a real public domain, you cannot transfer from one to the other. Here, the only reason we can carry is because we've declared ourselves to be one big private domain. When members of a courtyard make an Eiruv with each other to be able to carry in a courtyard, it is referred to legally as Eiruvei Chatzeres, the mixing of the courtyards. But if members of an alleyway, in other words, a bunch of courtyards want to get together and be able to carry in the shared alleyway, or a bunch of people in the city want to get together and be able to carry in all the city streets, hu hanikra shituf. Legally, this is not called Eiruvei Chatzeres because it isn't courtyards. It isn't mixing in a courtyard. It's a bunch of courtyards getting together or a bunch of alleyways getting together. It's called shituf, partnership. Partnership of the alleyways, partnership of the city. But it's the same idea. In both cases, you're joining over a piece of food and saying the same way we're all united over the public places, we're also united over the private places, and the entire thing thereby becomes a private place and everybody can carry. Halacha Ches says the Rambam, Ein ma'arvin b'chatzeres ela bepas shlema bilvad. The food which we use to declare this Eiruv, this joint ownership, can only be a loaf of bread that's complete, that's whole. Afilu kikar ma'afei sa'ah v'hi prusa. Even if you have a loaf, which is the product of a sa'ah, which is a big volume of grain, but it's broken, ein ma'arvin, but we don't use it for the Eiruv. Ha'isa shleima v'hi ke'isar. On the other hand, if it was a whole loaf, the size of a coin, ma'arvin, but it can be used to establish the Eiruv. The same way you can use grain-based bread, wheat bread, barley bread. There's 5 grains we saw in the laws of brachot: wheat, barley, oats, spelt, and rye. Any bread from those types of grain can serve the purpose. In the same way, we can use rice bread or lentil bread. They're also considered to be extra filling, and they can be used in the process of an Eiruv. But not millet bread. Millet bread isn't considered as important, and so you cannot be used in making the Eiruv. The shituf, however, when it comes to shituf, which is a larger partnership, it's not people in a courtyard, it's a number of courtyards getting together to carry in the alleyway. Bein bepas, bein bishar eicholim. Over here we can use both bread or other food. Within the courtyard, it's got to be bread. Once you're going beyond that, it can be anything. B'chol eichol mishtatfin. One can use any food to create these partnerships. Chutz min hamayim bifnei atzma, ne'melech bifnei atzma, with the exception of water alone or salt alone. Those two aren't considered to be mazon. They aren't considered to be food, filling food, and they cannot be used. V'chein kmein upitriyos, truffles and mushrooms also ein mishtatfin bahen, cannot be used in creating the partnership, she'enon chashuvin ka'echelim, because they're not considered to be full-fledged foods. Eirav mayim im melech, if you were to mix water and salt, now you've created a third entity, salt water. Nasa kemurios, it becomes considered like brine, which is a little more important. Umishtatfin, and the joint ownership, the partnership can be created over this water-salt mixture. What is the amount of food? How much food has to be put into the pot to be able to create this partnership? So the Rambam says, initially you begin with the following measurement. One requires the volume of a dried fig per person in the shared alleyway or per person in the city. Remember, we're talking about mishtatfin. If it's bread, if it's Eiruvei Chatzeres, just the courtyard ones, that's only having bread being used and it's a whole loaf. Here we're talking about other foods because we're talking about the partnership of alleyways or cities. Over there you got to have a volume of a dried fig per person. That's for the first 18 people. 18 or less people are involved in this partnership. Each one requires the volume of a dried fig. But if there were more than 18 people, now there's a flat rate. All you have to do is create the amount of food that would usually be consumed during 2 meals, shehein, which happens to be the volume of 18 dried figs, otherwise known in halachic legal measurement as 6 egg volumes, average egg volumes. Even if there's thousands and myriads of people involved in this partnership, 2 meals is enough to cover everybody. Halacha Yud. Kol oichel shehu nechal kamais shehu. Any food that's eaten as is, going pas or mine dagan ubasar chai, like bread, different types of grain, raw meat, im nishtatfu by, if they were used in the creation of the partnership to bring the alleyway together or the city together, shiurei mezoin shtei seudais, the rate follows, as we said before, enough to be eaten during 2 meals. But if they're using a food which is typically a condiment, and it's used in accompaniment to eating bread, like pasteurized wine, and roast meat, and vinegar and brine, and olives and onion heads, then you don't have to have enough to create 2 meals. You have to have enough that would usually be eaten during 2 meals. Because the meals consist mainly of bread, let's say. These are all side dishes, meat and vinegar and brine and olives, etc. So you figure how much of this stuff would you typically eat during 2 meals. That's how much you have to create the partnership. And the Rambam actually goes through a little list, gives us some detail. Halacha Yud Aleph, nishtatfu b'yayin chai. If the partnership is being created over raw wine straight from the press, shi'urei shtei revi'iyos lekulan. You'd bring 2 revi'is. A revi'is is a quarter of a log. We'll soon see more about this in a minute. 2 revi'is measurements covers everybody. V'chein b'sheichar shtei revi'is, beer has the same amount, 2 revi'is. Beitzim shtayim, if you're using eggs to create the partnership, 2 eggs. Typically you eat 1 egg per meal, 2 eggs cover the entire thing. Partnership can be created over eggs even if they're actually raw. For Rimainim Shnayim, if it's pomegranates, also 2 cover everything. Esreg Echad, 1 esreg covers everything. Because esregs were eaten more sparingly. You didn't finish a full esreg in 1 meal, it took 2 meals. Chamisha Egoizim, Chamisha Afarsikim, if you're using walnuts, it's 5. If you're using peaches, it's 5. Litra Shel Yarak, if it's vegetables that you're using, it's 1 litra. They translate here as a Roman pound. We're going to soon define how much that is. Bein chai, bein shalak, this applies whether you're using raw vegetables or stewed vegetables. But if it's vegetables that are neither here nor there, they're not cooked fully, and they're not raw fully, ein ma'arvin boy, we cannot use them in the process of creating an Eiruv, because they're not fitting to be eaten. Either raw vegetables are fit to be eaten or fully stewed. In the middle, not here nor there, is not used for food. Uchla tevalin, kav temarim. If you're using spices, you need an uchla. An uchla is a measurement. We'll soon see. It's a half of a revi'is. Again, we'll soon define these measurements in detail. If you're using dates, it's 1 kav. We'll define also what a kav is soon. Kav groigros. If you're using dried figs, actual dried figs, you need 1 kav to cover everybody. Maneh devela. If you're using a cake of dried figs, you need 1 maneh. We'll soon define what that is. Kav tapuchin. If you're using apples, 1 kav of apples covers the partnership. Kishus. If you're using, they call this the daughter plant on the left. Daughter, not like a daughter and son. Daughter, D-O-D-D-E-R. It's a parasitic plant that grows on thorn bushes typically, but it's edible. Enough to fill a handful. Poilin lachin kimle hayad. If you're using moist lima beans, also a handful covers the partnership. Chaziz. Chaziz, they say, is the plant here on the side there. It kind of like grows on algae, but also edible. 1 litra of the chaziz is required for the partnership. The hatradin, if you're using beets, harehin b'chal yarak or ma'arvin behind, they're included in vegetables. Follow the same rules. 1 litra is the amount that you need, and you can use them in the process of making an Eiruv. Alei betzalim, onion leaves, ein ma'arvin bahen. You cannot use them in the process of an Eiruv. Ela im hivtzilu v'nasa oirach kol olam mihen zeres, unless they've grown out so big that each leaf is a zeres in length. A zeres is kind of a handspan. It's the distance from here to the top of the pinky. And that's a pretty big leaf. That's when it becomes edible for human consumption, and that's when it can be used in the process of creating the Eiruv. If it's less than that, it isn't considered to be food. All of these things which we just listed, are considered to be like condiments, and therefore they follow these amounts. Remember, if you're using bread, or things that are the mainstay of a meal, then we just go with the amount of the figs. Up to 18 people, it's 18 figs. Up to 18 people or more, it's the amount that you would eat during 2 meals. All these things are considered to be condiments, so they follow the rule of however much would be eaten of these things during 2 meals. And the same applies to anything similar. All different foods can combine to create the amount required to create the partnership. Now, because the Rambam mentioned a bunch of different measurements, litra and maneh and kav and all these things, he spends a couple of halachot defining the different measurements in the Torah. And while the Rambam presents it one way, and it's probably with good reason, related to the topic at hand, I'm going to bring it out a bit differently so we can appreciate the order. The top 4 measurements that you see on the screen here in the first line are very primary and they're used very often in Jewish law. All the way on the right, we have the se'ah, then we have the kav, then we have the log, and then we have the revi'is. The revi'is literally means a quarter because it's a quarter of a log. In common measurements, many sages have worked to define it exactly what these measurements are. We're going to follow the definition of Rabbi Avraham Chaim Noah, who was widely accepted, although there is another primary opinion, the Chazon Ish, who has a much larger quantity measurement for these things. But we're going to follow Rabbi Avraham Chaim Noah. The revi'is he defines as 86.4 milliliters, which converts to about roughly 2.9 ounces. There are 4 revi'is in every lug. That's the number in the middle there. So a lug is made up of 4 revi'is. So if you take revi'is, 86.4 milliliter, times 4, that's 345.6 milliliter, about 11.6 ounces. 4 lug equals a kav. That's now 1.4 liters, or 46.7 ounces. And 6 kav equals a se'ah, which is 8.3 liters, or 280.4 ounces. All roughly, again, do the math on your own. You'll get all the different decimals. But these are 4 primary measurements. Se'ah is made up of 6 kav, which in turn has 4 log, which in turn has 4 revi'is. So in this halacha, when we saw some of the revi'is being mentioned, or the kav being mentioned, that's what it's referring to. Now, there are 2 other measurements that are directly related to the revi'is. Go to the second line there. You see the revi'is? 2 revi'is is called a litra. So if one revi'is is 86.4 milliliters, 2.9 ounces, the litra is 172 milliliters, about 5.8 ounces. And in the revi'is, there are 2 uchlas. We mentioned before the uchla when it comes to spices, an uchla of spices, which means, in modern English, an uchla is half of a revi'is. Half of 86.4 milliliters, 43.2 milliliters. Knowing this, we can appreciate what the Rambam is about to say in the first line of Halacha Yud Beis. Litra ha'amura b'chol makom. When you describe the Roman pound, litra, at any place, miloi shtei revi'iyos, it means the amount of 2 revi'is, the uchla, chatzir revi'is, and an uchla is a half of a revi'is. Now the Rambam jumps to a different set of measurements, which he'll soon bring back to the ones we just discussed. And this is actually coinage measurements. The biggest one is called the maneh. Maneh is at the top. Now, although we're talking in coinage, but the coins had a very specific weight. So in a way, these were also weight measurements, because the way they used to make coins was by weight. So maneh is the maneh coin. It was worth 100 dinar. There was 100 dinar in a maneh, much like there's 100 cents in a dollar. Same idea, but it was actual weight. A dinar was 100th in weight of a maneh. A sela is also a bigger coin. It had only 4 dinar though. 4 dinar per sela. Think about 4 quarters to the dollar. A little similar. A little different, a little similar. Either way, dinar was a second in the chain. You had maneh as a big coin, sela as a big coin. They can both be converted into dinars. A maneh, 100 dinars. A sela, 4 dinars. Each dinar had 6 ma'ah, or ma'in in the plural. 1 ma'ah, 2 ma'in. And each ma'ah had 16 se'ora. That was the weight. It was 16 barley corns. So you have barley corn was the standard by which the coin's weight was set. 16 barley corns, the weight of 16 barley corns created a ma. 6 times that created a dinar. And 100 times that created a maneh, or 4 times that created a sela. So the Rambam, as the Rambam says right here now, umaneh ha'amura b'chol makom. Continuing inside here, the maneh which is spoken of in every place, me'ah dinar is 100 dinar. The hadinar sheish ma'in. Follow the chain on the screen. The dinar is 6 ma'ah. The hama mishkal sheish esrei sa'ires, and the ma'ah has the weight of 16 barley corns. And by the way, the hasela arba'a dinar. And when we use the coin of sela, it's 4 dinar, not 100 dinar, it's 4 dinar. Okay, so we have the first line of measurements on this page, all relative to the revius. Right? If you take a revius, the revius is the key to this entire page. 4 times the revius is a log, 4 times that is the kav and the sa'ah. 2 times the revius is the litra, half of the revius is the uchla. What is the revius? Now, I've given you the measurement, 86.4 milliliter, but in the Talmud, they would say this revius against the coinage that I just mentioned. They would describe the revius's weight in terms of the coin's weight. So the Rambam says, when you take a revius, there's enough water or wine in that revius, mishkal shiva asar dinarim v'chatzi dinar bekeruv, about 17.5 dinar. So using the coins, let's bring back the revius there on the bottom. The revius, says the Rambam, was 17.5 dinars. Nimtza, which would mean halitra, which is 2 reviusin, is mishkal chamisha shleishim dinar. 17.5 times 2 is 35. The ha'uchla, which is half of a revius, is mishkal tisha dinar in pachais revia, is 9 less a quarter. In English we call that 8.75. 8 3/4 of a dinar. And now the Rambam goes back to the first line, which I showed you before, just because it's kind of more primary. Am I here? Halacha Yud Gimel, Sa'ah Amura B'chol Makom, when we say the Sa'ah in every place, Sheishas Kabin, it's 6 kav, the Hakav Arba Lugin, a kav is 4 log, the Halog Arba Revi'iyos, and the log is 4 revi'iyos, Ukvar Bi'arnu Midas Revi'iyos, Mishkala, we've already explained the measurement of the revi'iyos and its weight, 17.5 dinar. The Elu HaShi'urin Sha'adam Tzarich Lizkar Eisan Tamid, these are the amounts, Torah, legal measurements that one has to remember always. These are going to come up multiple times over the course of our study of Rambam. This is the first time where they actually came up in a serious way, so the Rambam pauses immediately to define the measurements based on the Torah. But now with all this knowledge, we can appreciate a little more what we said before in Halacha Yud Aleph, Halacha 11, about all these amounts. Litra of vegetables means 2 times the revius, 35 dinar weight of vegetables. When we said an uchla of spices, we mean that amount, 8 3/4 dinar weight of spices. When we said a kav of dates, using the kav, that's 4 times 4 the revius. So figure the amount of dinars that would go into the kav, etc. And it was basically weighed against the coin at the time. And I've given you the modern conversion elements where we see how much it is in liters or fluid ounces as it applies to today's measurements as we know them, as we're familiar with them today. Let us now move back to the laws of Eiruv. Halacha Yudalid, Oichel Shu Mutar Ba'achila, food which is permitted to be eaten. Afal Pishu Asr Lazeh Ma'arev, even though it's forbidden to the specific person who's taking part of the Eiruv, we have such things. Kosher food, totally kosher food, that some people cannot eat. We'll soon see an example. You, the person who cannot eat this food, because it's kosher, you can be part of the Eiruv being established around that food. Ketzad, what does that look like? Mishtatef hanazir beyayin. We're all very familiar with the Nazirite. Person takes a vow not to grow his hair, not to drink wine. It's kosher wine. He can't drink it. But if an Eiruv is being established around wine in his courtyard, he could take part of the Eiruv. The Yisrael Bitruma. A regular Jew can take part of an Eiruv that's being established over Truma. We had this before, and even though it's not so relevant here, but we're going to just review it again because it's so core to Jewish legal knowledge. Every time a farmer created a crop, all the crop is called tevel, untithed produce, till he takes specific gifts from this produce. The first one was called truma, or truma gedola, the big truma, 2% given to the Kohen. Then you would take 10%, give it to the Levi, another 10%, and it's for yourself, but it would be eaten in a more holy state in Jerusalem. From the Levi's 10%, you would always take trumat maaser, 10% of that, and give it to the Kohen. So the truma can only be eaten by a Kohen. Let's say you have a courtyard where there's 9 Kohanim and 1 regular Jew living there. So the 9 Kohanim go, you know what, we have so much truma, let's join forces over the truma. Let's make the Eiruv be established around the truma. And the Yisrael, the regular Jew, goes, hey, I can't eat truma. Can I still be part of it? Yes, you can. Similarly, if a person makes a vow not to eat a certain food, or he makes an oath not to eat a certain food, oath and vow sound very similar, but we're going to soon see in this soon. In the 6th book of the Rambam, God willing, there's a very big difference between oaths and vows. Oaths are the person prohibiting himself from using something. Vows apply to the object. The object becomes forbidden to me. And there are many different technical, legal details that emerge from that difference. Bottom line is you made a promise in one way or another that I'm not going to eat a certain food. If an Eiruv is being established in your courtyard, or a Shituf is being established in your alleyway or your city over this piece of food, you can be part of it. You may not be able to eat it, but somebody else can. But if it's something forbidden to everybody, nobody in this joint process can eat it. Tevel is the untithed produce. Afilu tevel shel divrei seifrim. Even if it's rabbinic tevel. We'll see in the 7th book of the Rambam all about agriculture. There are certain foods that you don't have to tithe by biblical law, but rabbinically you do. So if you have to tithe it rabbinically, before you tithe it, it's considered rabbinic tevel, forbidden to everybody. Those cannot be part of an Eiruv. B'chein, similarly, maaser rishoin shaloi nitla trumasei kahagen. You have the first tithe that its truma was not taken properly. See here on the slide. The Levi, when he gets the 10% from the farmer, has to take 10% of that and give it to a Kohen. If it was not taken properly, and the way the Rambam explained this earlier in the Laws of Brachot, for those who remember that far back, the idea was that the Levi approached the farmer while his crop was still in raw stalks, and he grabbed his 10%. And then the truma didn't go to the Kohen. Same applies to the second tithe. The second tithe, we see here, it goes to Yerushalayim. There you have it, on the bottom. Part of the process of bringing your second tithe to Yerushalayim was that you had to bring the actual food. But let's say you lived far from Jerusalem, you couldn't bring the actual food, it would rot by the time you got there. So what you would do is you would redeem it. You would buy it, transfer the holiness onto money. When you did that, you had to add a fifth out of your own pocket, which is actually a quarter. Not exactly a fifth, but we'll get into the details of that in the 7th book of the Rambam. Just suffice it to say, you add a quarter of the value. So you have Maaser Sheni, or Hekdesh. The same law applies to anything that you consecrate to the temple. If I make my cow holy to the temple, and the next day I want to use it, I have to buy it back from Hekdesh by adding a fifth to its value. So if I didn't, shaloi nifdu kahalacha, if it wasn't redeemed as the law demands, so now in a way, these foods are all still forbidden to everybody. Ein ma'arvin u'mishtatfin b'hem. They cannot be used in the process of making an Eiruv or a Shituf because they're universally prohibited to everybody. Aval ma'arvin u'mishtatfin b'dmai, but demai, one can use demai in making an Eiruv. What is demai? Demai means produce about which there's a doubt. You're not sure if it was tithed or not. Because as we'll see in the 7th book of the Rambam, poor people can eat it. A poor person can eat from this doubtful, untithed produce. And if you have the tithe of the which is given to the Levi, whose truma was taken, even if the trumat maaser wasn't given. I made a mistake before. Before when I said that the first maaser, the truma wasn't taken, it means the first truma to the Kohen wasn't taken, because the Levi went and grabbed the unripe stalks, the unprocessed stalks. Here we're talking about you have a tithe, you have a maaser yishon, you gave the truma, but the trumat maaser wasn't given. Uve maaser sheni v'hekdesh shenifdu, and the second tithe and the hekdesh that were redeemed. Afal pish le'nasa nasa chaimesh, even if you didn't give the extra fifth that you were supposed to, she'ein ha'chaimesh ma'akeh, because the fifth isn't essential. You redeemed it, you bought it back, that's already enough. That makes it permitted and can be used in the establishment of an Eiruvin. Ume'arvin b'maaser sheni b'Yerushalayim. You can also use the actual maaser sheni, the second tithe food, while it's in Jerusalem, to establish an Eiruv. Because over there it's permitted to be eaten. But you cannot use that food outside of Jerusalem because it cannot be eaten outside of Jerusalem. Now that we know that you have to make an Eiruv, and we know what an Eiruv is, joining forces over a piece of food or a specific amount of food, says the Rambam, Ketzad ma'arvin b'chatzeres. What's the step-by-step process to create this mixture of the courtyards? You go around to each home in the courtyard, and you get one challah. Oops. My slideshow here seems to have logged out. Bear with me, please. We'll be back in a moment. You take one challah from each home. And you put everything, all the gathered food, into one vessel, in one home, out of the homes in the courtyard. And it doesn't have to be a residential home. Even if you're putting it in the home where you keep the straw, or where you keep cattle, or where you store just a regular storage room. Sorry about this. Those are still okay, because they're considered to be some kind of residential purposes over there. Your animals live there, your food is stored there. Aval im nesane bebeis shar, but if you were to put it in the base shar, this is the base shar here on the screen. It's the gateway into a gated community or into a courtyard. The watchman used to sit there and he had a little room for dwelling, but it wasn't big enough to be considered a legal home. So if you put the Eiruv into the base shar, afilu base shar shel yachid, even if it belongs to an individual, oiba achsadra, or you put it into a little patio. This is a kind of an achsadra, it's kind of an area enclosed between two homes. Oiba mir peset, or onto a porch. This is the porch that Rambam describes it himself in his commentary to the Mishnah. A little bit complex for what we're used to today, but there was stairs going up to a second floor. There was a porch, and the porch itself had stairs to a higher floor. That's a mirpeses. Or into any other structure which does not have the square footage, square ama'ij, of 4 by 4 amot. Einay Eiruv, it's not considered an Eiruv. It has to go into a home that can serve as a residence technically, which means it's at least 4 by 4 amot in space. Once you've gathered all the food for the Eiruv, you make the following blessing. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvaysav v'tzivanu al mitzvahs Eiruv. Hashem commanded us, sanctified us with His mitzvahs, and commanded us to make the Eiruv. And then you say, Be'eruv zeh, with this mixture, it should be permitted for everybody in the courtyard to carry in and carry out from different homes on Shabbos. A child can be appointed to collect all the food for the Eiruv. The home which is hosting the Eiruv doesn't have to contribute with their own food. And once you establish that a certain home is used for keeping the Eiruv there, so we don't change that. To keep the ways of peace, this is his mitzvah, it's his merit, you keep it by him. Halacha Yud Zayin, Beketzad Mishtatfin B'mavoi. How does the partnership in the alleyway, it's a little bit of a bigger property space. How does that work? You go ahead, you don't take the bread, it doesn't have to be bread. You get food the size of a dried fig from every single person. Or if there are more, you don't have to, you can get less than a dried figs volume because you only need to have 18 dried figs in total. And you put everything in one vessel and keep it in one of the courtyards or in one of the homes within the courtyards. And here, even a small home, even the patio, even the porch, all work. It's considered to be a partnership. But if you left it in the open air, in the alleyway, that's not considered a partnership. Because the partnership happens between the courtyards. It happens in the alleyway, but the food goes into one of the courtyards. If you left the vessel in the open courtyard, it needs to be at least raised above the ground 1 handbreadth, so it should be recognizable. And here too, you make the blessing. Hashem commanded us to make the Eiruv, and then you say, declaration, with this partnership, it will be permitted for all people living in this alleyway to carry in and carry out from their courtyards to the alleyway on Shabbos. So integral is the idea of putting it all in one utensil, that if you didn't put all the foodstuffs from the Eiruv into one vessel, you divided it into a couple, even if it's in one house, it doesn't qualify as an Eiruv. But if you had filled up your vessel, you were looking to get it all in one vessel, and then it overflowed, there was some left over that couldn't fit, and you had to, per force, put it in a different vessel, mutar, that's allowed. It's very interesting. Let's say a bunch of courtyards got together, and they partnered up to allow carrying in the alleyway. So you would say the courtyards already came together. All the individuals in the courtyard shouldn't need to make their own Eiruv to carry in their courtyard. Nevertheless, they do. Just because you're partnering in an alleyway doesn't exempt you from mixing in your own courtyard. So children should not forget the laws of Eiruv. Look how important education is. If you're only going to do the big stuff, the big shituf, the kids will forget about the small details. But if they observe that you're doing it even in your home, you're making your own individual Eiruv Chatzeros for the courtyards as well, then they're always going to remember that. Kids don't know what's happening in the big world, in the big alleyways. They know what's happening in their homes. Tells you about how to parent and how to educate. What matters is what happens in your home. The main values are there. Therefore, if they partnered in an alleyway using bread, you can rely on them, and then you won't have to do an Eruv in your courtyard. Typically, the courtyard Eruv requires bread. The alleyway Eruv doesn't require bread. But if children will see you taking your bread, which is important food, to the alleyway, they notice that. And they're not going to let that slip, and they realize, Daddy's going to do the big Eruv, and it's also counting for our home. Let's say you had people sitting together, and it comes in Shabbos. Shabbos comes in on their meal, and they didn't make an Eruv. They're living, they're residents in the same courtyard. Their bread on the table can be used to rely upon and becomes their Eruv. If they're living in the different courtyards within one alleyway, they can rely on that also for the shituf, to create the partnership in the alleyway. They can rely, even though right now they happen to be reclining, they happen to be eating only in one courtyard, but they can say we wanted to count for all the courtyards to be able to carry in the alleyway. If one of the people in the courtyard took one piece of bread and said, you know what, I don't want to go around collecting in every single home in the courtyard getting their own bread. Here's my bread. I want to make everybody have a part in this piece of bread. Or he's in the bigger alleyway shituf. He's holding a piece of food big enough to take care of 2 meals. And he says, you know what, I don't want to collect. This is for everybody. He need not collect from every single person. But you have to grant them a portion in this food by using somebody else. This is called zechut. If you want to give somebody else a portion in your food, you have to have somebody else next to you and say, hey, pick this up on behalf of Mr. A. Now pick it up on behalf of Mr. B. Now pick it up on behalf of Mr. C. And by somebody else picking it up for them, they are acquiring, so to speak, their part in your food. The yesh leila zakos, who can a person use in this process? He can use his older adult son and daughter, or his wife, or his Jewish servant. You cannot use minor kids under bar bat mitzvah, nor non-Jewish maidservants or slaves, because their hand is like your hand. They don't have their own authority. You have to have an acquisition take place on behalf of somebody else. You need somebody who has a separate identity from you. You can pass on acquisition through your Jewish maidservant, even if she's a child. Because a child can acquire on behalf of other people for something which is rabbinic, and therefore that's the one exception. You don't even have to tell them that you did this for them. The rest of your alleyway partners or your courtyard partners, because you've already acquired it for them and you've made the Eiruv for them. It's a merit for them. Everybody wants to be able to carry on Shabbos. You're not making them obligatory or obliged in anything. You're giving them benefit. We have a principle in Jewish law. We can grant benefit to somebody else even if he's not watching, even if he doesn't consent, let's say. The Eruv or the Shituf cannot be created on the Shabbos. It must be done while it's still day. They can be done at the last moment in the twilight zone between Friday and Shabbos. You can make the Eruv, make the Shituf, even though it's doubtful whether it's day or night. However, you must always have access to the food of Eruv or Shituf. It must be available, the efshar la'achle kol bein hashmashos, and be able to be eaten at the entirety of the twilight zone. Lefichach, therefore, im nafal alav gale avad nisraf, if a pile of stones fell upon the food, or it got lost or burnt, or it was truma food and it got impure, now no longer fit to eat. If it happened while it's still day, it's not an Eruv because Shabbos entered and the food was unedible. But if this accident happened after Shabbos came in, after you've already established your Eruv over the food, and it was edible when Shabbos came in, Harei Eruv, it remains a valid Eruv. If it's a doubt, Harei Eruv, we keep it an Eruv, Shesfeika Eruv Kosher, because an Eruv in doubt is kosher. Anything in rabbinic law, whenever we're in doubt, we go lenient. If you put the Eruv food or the Shituf food into a little closet and you lock the closet, and you lost the key before it gets dark. You didn't lose the food. Food's still accessible, food's still edible, but you lost the key. If the only way to get the food out is to do something which would be considered biblical work, labor on the Shabbos, and you have to do it in the twilight zone, the food is considered lost and it isn't an Eiruv. Because you can't eat it. Hifrish trumas meiser truma gedola. V'hisna aleha shaloi tia truma ache techshach. It's quite an involved, specific case. A person, a Levi, separates the trumas meiser, right? From his 10%, he gives 10% to the Kohen. Or the farmer separates his 2% to the Kohen. Now, as soon as you separate it, it becomes truma, holier food. Let's say he separated it on Friday, but he made a stipulation that it's not going to become truma till it gets dark. Ein ma'arvin ba. You cannot use it for an Eiruv, because it's unedible while Shabbos came in. It's only edible once it becomes truma, albeit edible only to a Kohen, but it's edible. Before you take truma, the whole food is called tevel, it's called untithed produce, nobody can eat it. So if you made a stipulation that you only want your food to become truma when Shabbos comes in, when Shabbos came in, it wasn't edible. Sha'adayini tevel kol bein hashmashas, the entire time of the twilight zone, it was still considered untithed produce, and the Eiruv has to be a meal fit to be eaten while it's still day. And so in that case, it would still be forbidden to make the Eiruv on it, and it cannot be used in establishment of the Eiruv.